May 1945. The world celebrated the defeat of Nazi Germany, but for millions of Germans, it was the beginning of something even more terrifying. The Red Army's final surge unleashed 2.2 million soldiers across burning towns and devastated cities, while civilian columns fled under fire, starvation, and freezing winds. Behind ruined walls, survivors in Berlin faced violence that left entire neighborhoods broken forever. In places like Dresden and Demmin, firestorms and mass suicides marked a catastrophe too vast to comprehend. This is not the story of battlefield orders, but of ordinary people trapped in the aftermath, a story seldom told as genocide, the horrific genocide of the German people after World War II. But how did a nation fall from defeat into disaster on such a staggering scale? On January 12th, 1945, the Vistula Oder offensive began before dawn, when more than 2 million Soviet troops surged westward from their positions along the Vistula River. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev commanded the two main Soviet fronts, unleashing over 4,500 tanks, 13,700 artillery pieces, and a force that dwarfed the exhausted German defenders. The Red Army's assault started with a thunderous artillery barrage stretching for miles, lighting up the skies as Soviet guns raked German lines from Baranów in southern Poland to the Baltic coast. Within hours, entire sections of Army Group A's front collapsed. The German defenders, outnumbered 5-1, were already depleted by years of fighting and relentless Allied bombing. By nightfall, Soviet spearheads had broken through German positions and begun their rapid drive west, overrunning towns and villages at a pace that stunned even their own commanders. The offensive's momentum was relentless. Soviet tank armies punched deep into the Polish plains, bypassing pockets of resistance and cutting off German units from retreat. The Red Army advanced up to 30 miles a day, overrunning Warsaw just 5 days after the operation began. German attempts at counterattack failed almost immediately as Soviet columns reached the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin, by the end of January. In less than 3 weeks, the Soviets had carved a swath 300 miles wide and 300 miles deep into German-held territory. The scale of the operation left little doubt about the outcome. With 2.2 million troops and overwhelming firepower, the Soviets swept aside what remained of the Wehrmacht's Eastern Front. German soldiers and civilians alike began to flee westward in the dead of winter, their columns stretching for miles across snow-covered roads. The rapid collapse of German defenses along the Vistula and the sudden arrival of Soviet forces at the Oder signaled that the heart of Germany itself now lay exposed, with Berlin directly in the Red Army's path. On January 27th, 1945, Soviet soldiers reached the gates of Auschwitz. The camp, once guarded by thousands of SS men, now stood silent, except for the wind and the faint cries of those left behind. Inside, Red Army troops found about 7,000 prisoners still alive, men, women, and children who had survived months, even years, of starvation, disease, and forced labor. Most were too weak to walk, their bodies reduced to skin and bone, many lying motionless in their bunks, unable to rise even as liberation arrived. The Soviets moved through the snow-covered grounds, past barracks and watchtowers, and into the heart of the camp. They found evidence of killing on an industrial scale. Rows of gas chambers and crematoria, piles of shoes, suitcases, and human hair, the personal belongings of hundreds of thousands who had vanished. In the warehouses, they uncovered mountains of clothing, prosthetic limbs, and children's toys left behind by victims who had been told they were only being resettled. Photographs and documents scattered by the fleeing SS revealed the machinery of murder. Soviet officers recorded what they saw: furnaces still warm, the smell of burnt flesh lingering in the air, and open pits filled with ashes. The horror was not just in the numbers, but in the faces of survivors, many of them children orphaned by the camp. The Red Army's discovery of Auschwitz became a moment of moral reckoning. For soldiers who had lost families and villages to the German invasion, the sight of systematic extermination, witnessed firsthand, ignited a deep sense of outrage and grief. News of Auschwitz spread quickly through Soviet ranks and across the world, exposing the scope of Nazi crimes and fueling calls for justice and retribution. The liberation of Auschwitz was not simply a military milestone. It was a searing reminder of what had been done under German occupation, and it left a mark on every soldier who walked through those gates. By the start of February 1945, the Red Army had reached the Oder River, pausing just 60 kilometers east of Berlin. Soviet artillery now rumbled across the plains of Brandenburg, and the capital itself stood within range of heavy guns for the first time in the war. The front lines stretched from Kustrin in the north down to Guben in the south, forming a tight arc that encircled Berlin's eastern approaches. German defenses facing the river were a patchwork of battered Wehrmacht units, Volkssturm militias, and hastily armed boys from Hitler Youth battalions. Most had little ammunition, no reserves, and almost no hope of reinforcement. Inside Berlin, the mood shifted from grim determination to outright panic. News of the Soviet advance swept through the city's neighborhoods. Refugee columns from Silesia and East Prussia crowded the train stations, desperate to escape before the final siege. Food was already scarce, and air raid sirens sent families scrambling to cellars as Soviet bombers began their first daylight raids on the city. The streets echoed with rumors. Some whispered that the Soviets would show no mercy. Others clung to the fantasy that miracle weapons or last-minute negotiations might save the city. The German High Command tried to rally the city's defenders, but few believed their promises. Army Group Vistula, newly formed under Heinrich Himmler, existed mostly on paper. Most regular army officers knew the truth. The Oder line could not hold. Every day, Soviet reconnaissance patrols probed the river crossings, and artillery strikes crept closer to the city's heart. By mid-February, the sound of distant shell fire became a constant presence, a reminder that the capital was now the next and final target. Berlin's fate now hung on the river's edge. The Red Army's vanguard waited for orders to cross, while inside the city, a sense of dread settled over the population. For millions, the war was no longer a distant thunder. It was coming straight for the heart of Germany, and there was nowhere left to run. On April the 23rd, 1945, as Soviet artillery rumbled ever closer to the heart of Berlin, the first open rupture inside Hitler's inner circle erupted, not from the outside, but from the depths of the Nazi hierarchy itself. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal and Hitler's oldest political ally, sat in his mountain residence at Obersalzberg, hundreds of miles from the collapsing capital. News had reached him that Hitler, barricaded in the Führer bunker, had told his generals he intended to remain in Berlin until the end. With the Red Army closing in and the city's defenses crumbling, Göring faced an agonizing decision. 3 years earlier, on June the 29th, 1941, Hitler had signed a secret decree naming Göring as his successor should he lose his freedom of action. Now, as Berlin's fate was sealed and Hitler's isolation deepened, Göring's advisors, including Hans Lammers and Luftwaffe chief Karl Koller, pored over the decree. The language was clear. If Hitler became incapacitated or unreachable, Göring was to act with full authority. The only question was whether the moment had arrived. At 15:10, Göring dictated a telegram addressed directly to the Führer bunker. "My Führer, in view of your decision to remain in the fortress of Berlin, do you agree that I take over at once the total leadership of the Reich, with full freedom of action at home and abroad as your deputy, in accordance with your decree of June 29th, 1941? If no reply is received by 10 o'clock tonight, I shall take it for granted that you have lost your freedom of action and shall consider the conditions of your decree as fulfilled, and shall act for the best interests of our country and our people. You know what I feel for you in this gravest hour of my life. Words fail me to express myself. May God protect you and speed you quickly here in spite of all. Your loyal Hermann Göring." The message was sent through multiple channels to ensure it reached Hitler, whose communications were now at the mercy of encirclement and bombardment. Göring set a deadline. If he received no reply by 2200 hours, he would assume leadership as the decree required. As the hours ticked by, the telegram arrived in the bunker, passing through the hands of Martin Bormann, who had long resented Göring's influence. Bormann seized the opportunity, framing the telegram as an ultimatum, a veiled coup, not a loyal inquiry. Joseph Goebbels, ever the master of intrigue, agreed with Bormann's interpretation. Together, they presented the message to Hitler as evidence of betrayal at the highest level. In the bunker's suffocating gloom, Hitler's trust collapsed. Göring's appeal, rooted in legal authority, was twisted into the first unmistakable sign that the Nazi leadership was fracturing from within. The Reichsmarshal's fate now hung in the balance, as Hitler's rage turned inward and the circle of loyalty shrank to its final desperate core. Inside Berlin, the war closed in with every hour. By April, artillery shells shook the ground day and night, and the city's population, once bustling with families, had become a city of women, children, and the elderly. Most able-bodied men were gone, lost to the front lines or the grave. The city's lifelines had already snapped. Water ran only in fits and starts, often brown or laced with debris. Electricity flickered out for days at a time, and gas lines sputtered dry. In many districts, even the most basic services had vanished. Food was measured in crumbs. Rations, when they arrived, brought little more than a few potatoes or a handful of flour. Children lined up for hours at shattered storefronts, hoping for a ladle of thin soup, while mothers bartered wedding rings for a loaf of bread. The black market thrived in the shadows, but most had nothing left to trade. Sewage overflowed into the streets, and disease spread quickly through crowded basements and cellars, places that now served as both bomb shelter and home for thousands. As the Soviet troops pressed into the city, the threat moved from distant rumor to daily terror. Berlin's women faced the worst of it. With the front collapsing and no police or military protection, sexual violence became widespread. Historians estimate that between 95,000 and 130,000 women in Berlin were raped during the first weeks of occupation. Some victims were assaulted repeatedly, sometimes by groups of soldiers moving from house to house. Many did not survive the attacks. Others took their own lives in the aftermath. Hospitals, already overwhelmed by the wounded, struggled to care for the living. Doctors reported a surge in suicides, and pharmacies ran out of sleeping pills and poisons. Crowded into cellars, families listened to the thunder of artillery and the shouts of soldiers in the streets above. Every knock at the door brought fear. Some tried to disguise themselves, smearing dirt on their faces, cutting their hair, dressing as old women, in hopes of avoiding notice. Yet the sense of safety was an illusion. Soviet soldiers, drunk on looted alcohol, broke into homes, searching for watches, food, and women. Appeals for mercy went unanswered. In this world of hunger and fear, the ordinary rules of life had vanished. Neighbors disappeared overnight. Children wandered, searching for missing parents. The city's famed parks and boulevards became fields of rubble, littered with the belongings of those who had fled or fallen. For many Berliners, the only certainty was that tomorrow would be worse than today. The daily struggle for survival left little room for hope as the city's last defenders fell and the Red Army's grip tightened. In the darkness of the cellars, Berlin's civilians waited, powerless, hungry, and afraid for whatever came next. On the night of April the 28th, in the dim light of the Führerbunker, Hitler summoned his secretary and dictated his last will and political testament. He named Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor and expelled Göring and Himmler from the party, accusing them of betrayal. The document, signed at 4 a.m. on April the 29th, was witnessed by Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and 2 generals. Not long after, Hitler and Eva Braun were married in a brief civil ceremony, witnessed by Goebbels and Bormann. The official who performed the marriage, Walter Wagner, had been brought down into the bunker from the devastated city above. Eva Braun, who had chosen to stay in Berlin rather than escape, signed the register, crossing out her maiden name and writing Eva Hitler. As Soviet artillery pounded the city overhead, Hitler made his final preparations. He gave away his personal belongings to staff, thanked his aides, and said, "Farewell." On April the 30th, after a last meal with Eva and his secretaries, Hitler retreated to his private study with his wife. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, a single gunshot echoed through the bunker. When the door was opened, Hitler was found slumped on the sofa, a bullet wound to his right temple, pistol at his feet. Eva had taken cyanide beside him. Their bodies were quickly wrapped in blankets, carried up the stairs, and doused with petrol in the shell-blasted garden. Under heavy fire, Hitler's closest aides set the bodies alight, fulfilling his order that nothing remained for the Soviets. The following day, Joseph and Magda Goebbels made their own grim decision. After drugging their 6 children, Magda crushed cyanide capsules in their mouths as they slept. Hours later, she and Goebbels left the bunker, climbed the steps to the garden, and took poison themselves. Their bodies were found partially burned, lying close to the spot where Hitler and Eva had been cremated. On May 2nd, Soviet troops stormed the Reichstag and raised the red flag over its shattered dome. The last German defenders in Berlin surrendered. A week later, at 2:41 a.m. on May 7th, in a schoolhouse in Reims, General Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. The war in Europe was over. The Nazi regime, born in violence, ended in suicide and ashes, leaving a country in ruins and millions of lives irreparably scarred. In July 1943, the city of Hamburg became the testing ground for a new kind of destruction. Operation Gomorrah, as the Allied air forces called it, brought together hundreds of British and American bombers in a concentrated assault that would set the standard for the firestorms to come. Over 8 days and nights, more than 37,000 tons of high explosives and incendiaries rained down on the city. The heat from the fires grew so intense that it created its own wind, pulling oxygen from the streets and lifting roofs from their beams. Entire neighborhoods vanished in a single night. Survivors spoke of streets paved with ash, of people suffocated in their cellars as the flames above consumed all the air. The death toll reached at least 34,000, with tens of thousands more wounded or left homeless. Hamburg's devastation showed what was possible when technology, weather, and tactics aligned, and it became a model for the air war's final phase. By 1945, the focus shifted to Dresden, a city until then largely untouched by the bombing campaigns. On the night of February the 13th, British Lancaster bombers appeared over the city, followed by a second wave hours later, and American B-17 bombers the next day. The timing was merciless. Dresden was packed with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance, many with nowhere else to go. In just 2 days, nearly 4,000 tons of bombs and incendiaries fell on the city center. The firestorm that followed was unlike anything most had ever seen. Temperatures inside the burning city soared, melting glass and turning the cobblestone streets into rivers of flame. The Frauenkirche, Dresden's famous church, withstood the first assault only to collapse from the heat 2 days later. Official estimates put the death toll at 25,000, though the true number may never be known. Bodies were found fused together in the ruins, mothers and children locked in a final embrace. Allied leaders justified the destruction as a blow to Germany's war machine. Dresden, they argued, was a vital transport hub, its rail yards and factories feeding supplies to the Eastern Front. But once the smoke cleared, it was obvious that the devastation reached far beyond military targets. Schools, hospitals, and entire residential districts had vanished. For the survivors, the line between soldier and civilian was erased in the heat of the firestorm. The raids on Hamburg and Dresden revealed the full power of area bombing, and for the people below, there was no refuge from the sky. In these cities, the war's logic reached its breaking point, leaving behind only ruins and the memory of a night when the world seemed to burn. Across the eastern provinces of what had been Germany, the end of the war brought not peace, but a new ordeal. The Potsdam Agreement, signed in August 1945 by the Allied leaders, authorized the transfer of German populations from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. The document called for these expulsions to be carried out in an orderly and humane manner. In reality, the process was anything but. As Soviet troops and newly empowered local authorities moved in, millions of ethnic Germans found themselves forced from homes their families had occupied for generations. The exodus began even before the fighting stopped, with columns of refugees winding westward through snow and mud, dragging what little they could carry, many already weakened by hunger and disease. Refugee convoys stretched for miles along frozen country roads. In Silesia and East Prussia, the winter of 1945 proved deadly. Children and the elderly collapsed in the drifts. Horses died in their traces. Survivors spoke of wagons abandoned in ditches, of bodies left unburied by the roadside, of mothers clutching infants already gone cold. Allied air attacks, intended to disrupt German troop movements, fell on these columns without distinction. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff on January 30th, 1945, remains the deadliest maritime disaster in history. More than 9,000 civilians and wounded soldiers drowned in the icy Baltic after a Soviet submarine torpedoed the overloaded ship. 2 weeks later, the Steuben went down with another 4,500 lives lost. The chaos of expulsion quickly turned to violence. Polish and Czech partisans, many of whom had suffered under Nazi occupation, now took revenge on German civilians. In Czechoslovakia, so-called wild expulsions broke out before any Allied oversight. Towns like Postelberg, Ústí, pronounced O-O-O-Sti, and Přerov, pronounced P-R-E-H-Rov, became scenes of massacre. In Přerov, 265 German men, women and children were forced to dig their own graves before being shot. In other regions, Germans were rounded up for forced labor or herded into makeshift camps where food and medical care were almost non-existent. Epidemics swept through the overcrowded barracks. Death records from the period show a sharp spike in infant mortality and suicides. Women and girls bore the brunt of the violence. Historians estimate that in the Eastern Territories, up to 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers and local militias between 1944 and 1947. In many towns, sexual assault was followed by public humiliation, beatings, or execution. Hospitals in Berlin reported that 95,000 to 130,000 women had been assaulted in the first weeks after the city's fall. Many survivors took their own lives, unable to endure the trauma or the shame. In the countryside, entire villages were emptied overnight. Some families tried to hide in forests or cellars, but few could avoid the patrols for long. The memory of Nazi atrocities on Soviet soil fueled the cycle of retribution. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had lost their own families to German occupation, often acted with a sense of vengeance that blurred any line between combatant and civilian. Yet the violence was not only a matter of revenge. The breakdown of order, the collapse of authority, and the sheer scale of the population movements created conditions where suffering multiplied without limit. By the end of 1946, more than 12 million Germans had been uprooted from their homes east of the Oder and Sudetenland. Contemporary records and modern research suggest that at least 500,000 died in the process of exposure, disease, violence, or despair. For those who survived, the journey westward marked not a return to safety, but the beginning of a new struggle as strangers in a devastated land. Demmin, a quiet town on the Peene River, became the site of a tragedy that would haunt its survivors for decades. As the Red Army approached on April 30th, 1945, Wehrmacht troops blew up every bridge, sealing the town off from escape. Thousands of refugees, already exhausted from flight, found themselves trapped alongside Demmin's residents. With the Soviets closing in, panic spread through the streets and cellars. The stories brought by refugees of villages burned, families torn apart, and women brutalized were no longer rumors, but the new reality. Soviet soldiers entered Demmin that afternoon. Negotiators had been shot at during surrender talks, and for 3 days, chaos reigned. Looting, arson, and sexual violence swept through the town. Houses were set alight with petrol, and Soviet guards kept firefighters away. The flames consumed most of the town center, while the riverbanks filled with desperate families. In this climate of terror, a wave of suicides began. Parents gathered their children, sometimes tying themselves together with ropes, and walked into the cold, shallow waters of the Peene, Tollenz, and Trebel. Some filled rucksacks with stones to be sure they would not float. Others hung themselves in the woods or took what poison or sleeping pills remained. Eyewitnesses like Gisela Zimmer, then 14, remembered the streets filled with screaming and the sense that death was the only escape. Her mother, after being assaulted, nearly joined the others in the river, pulled back only at the last moment by her daughter. Magda Goebbels' words echoed in Demmin's cellars. The world that comes after the Führer and National Socialism is not any longer worth living in. For many, the prospect of life under Soviet rule, after years of Nazi warnings about revenge and atrocities, was too much to bear. In just a few days, between 500 and 1,000 people, entire families, were gone. The youngest victims were infants, the oldest in their 80s. Soviet soldiers sometimes tried to pull people from the water, but the scale of despair was overwhelming. After the violence subsided, the rivers ran thick with bodies. Survivors buried the dead in mass graves, and the story of Demmin's mass suicide was quickly silenced by the new authorities. For decades, the topic was taboo, the graves left unmarked, and the memories carried quietly by those who remained. The events in Demmin stand as the largest mass suicide in German history, a stark testament to the psychological collapse that can follow not just defeat, but the total loss of hope and trust in the future. By May 1945, nearly 3 million German soldiers were in Soviet hands, the largest mass captivity in Europe's modern history. For these men, defeat was only the beginning. Stripped of rank and possessions, they were marched east, often for weeks, toward an uncertain fate behind barbed wire. Official Soviet records list 381,000 deaths among German prisoners of war. But West German investigations estimate over 1 million never returned. Most prisoners were sent to labor camps scattered from Ukraine to the Urals, where forced labor replaced freedom. In the Donbas, men worked in coal mines and steel mills. In the forests of Karelia, they cut timber. In uranium mines, they dug the raw material for a new atomic age. The work was relentless, the food barely enough to survive, and disease spread quickly in the overcrowded barracks. In the bitter winters of 1945 and 1946, many froze or starved before spring. Some prisoners, desperate to escape the camps, injured themselves, hoping to be sent home as invalids. Few succeeded. Repatriation came slowly, in waves, beginning in 1946, but stretching out for years. By 1949, hundreds of thousands had returned to a country they barely recognized, but tens of thousands remained missing. The last major group did not come home until 1955, after Chancellor Adenauer's visit to Moscow secured their release. For those who survived, the scars, physical and mental, would last a lifetime. The fate of these lost armies, scattered across the Soviet Union, became a silent legacy of defeat, a story told in letters that never arrived and families waiting at empty train stations. In November 1945, 24 of the highest-ranking surviving leaders of the Nazi regime were brought before the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. Judges from the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France presided over a courtroom where, for the first time, a defeated nation's top officials faced formal charges for crimes committed in the name of the state. The indictment listed 4 distinct categories: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. These charges reached back to the earliest days of Nazi rule and extended through the devastation of occupied Europe. Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, men who had sat at Hitler's side, now sat in the dock, flanked by armed guards, listening as prosecutors recounted the machinery of murder and the destruction unleashed across the continent. The trial opened with a declaration that the record made here would stand as a warning for all time. Evidence was presented in exhaustive detail: orders for mass shootings, blueprints for extermination camps, and films showing the aftermath of atrocities. Survivors testified about the ghettos, the camps, and the forced marches. The tribunal heard how entire cities had been leveled, how civilians had been starved, deported, and murdered on a scale the world had never seen. Yet, the scope of the trial was limited. The judges ruled they could only consider crimes committed after the start of the war in 1939, leaving earlier persecutions beyond their reach. Only the top leaders faced judgment. Thousands of lower-ranking perpetrators would never stand trial in Nuremberg. On October 1st, 1946, the verdicts were read out. 12 of the accused, including Göring, Ribbentrop, and Keitel, were sentenced to death by hanging. 3 were acquitted, and the rest received prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. The court also declared the SS, the Gestapo, and the Nazi leadership corps to be criminal organizations, but allowed for exceptions in cases of conscripts or those who had left before the war. In the end, the Nuremberg Tribunal established a new standard for international justice, but its reach was always partial. It punished the architects of the regime, but left countless crimes unaddressed, and it judged only the defeated. The world had witnessed a legal reckoning, but the lines between justice and vengeance would remain blurred for years to come. The end of the war left Germany a shattered land, but the struggle for its future had only begun. In the spring of 1946, the Allies imposed the first level of industry plan, ordering the dismantling of more than 1,500 factories and slashing steel production to a quarter of pre-war capacity. The goal was clear: to ensure that Germany would never again threaten the peace of Europe through its industrial might. Railways, mines, and entire production lines were stripped bare, with much of the machinery shipped east as reparations. In the Soviet zone, these removals went hand in hand with land reforms and the nationalization of key industries. In the Western zones, the British and Americans debated how far to push de-industrialization before it risked permanent economic collapse. Meanwhile, the political map of Germany was redrawn. The country was divided into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the major Allied powers. Berlin, the ruined capital, was itself carved into sectors, a microcosm of the new order. Tensions between the former Allies soon hardened. By 1949, the division was formalized. On May the 23rd, the Federal Republic of Germany, the ELRG, was proclaimed in Bonn, backed by the Western powers. 5 months later, on October the 7th, the Soviet authorities responded with the creation of the German Democratic Republic, or GDR, with its own government in East Berlin. The Iron Curtain had settled across Germany, splitting families, cities, and a nation that had once dominated the continent. The Petersburg Agreement, signed in November 1949, signaled the first steps toward a limited recovery for West Germany. Some restrictions on industry were eased, and dismantling slowed, but the scars of occupation and division would shape German life for decades. The 2 new states, FRG and GDR, set out on sharply different paths. In the West, the Marshall Plan and currency reform sparked a slow economic revival. In the East, the Soviet model brought state control and political repression. What had once been a single country was now the front line of a new conflict, as the world order that emerged from the ruins of war locked Germany in a new, uneasy balance. Between 1945 and 1949, over 12 million Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe, with documented deaths during flight and resettlement ranging from 500,000 to 2 million, according to German and Allied records. In cities like Dresden, 25,000 died in a single bombing, while up to 1.1 million German prisoners of war perished in Soviet captivity, as confirmed by the Maschke Commission and Soviet archives. The Nuremberg trials established a framework for prosecuting war crimes, but their focus on Nazi leaders left questions about broader accountability unanswered. Many Soviet and Allied documents on expulsions and reprisals remain classified or incomplete, leaving gaps in the full historical record. Today, Germany's division and reunification are living evidence of choices made in the post-war years. The suffering of civilians in defeat, while rooted in the crimes of the Nazi regime, stands as a documented warning of how violence can spread beyond the battlefield. The facts remain: The end of war did not bring peace for millions, and the search for truth continues in archives and memory.